Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I want to talk to you guys a little bit about strength building and muscle building in regards to range of motion. So let me put on my +5 out of weaponsmithing, work on scaling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, this is something that comes up a lot, something I've had to debate with people on a lot, and it can be a complex point that people don't always grasp. So let's see if we can bring this down and distill it down to a level that people can grasp. When we're talking about building strength, what you need to understand is that the best way to build strength on any exercise is to pick exercises or variations of the exercise that allows you to use as many muscles as possible, right? That's usually understood. In other words, a squat will build more strength than a leg press, but a leg press will build more strength than a leg extension. So that's usually generally understood because, again, the more muscles you involve, not only the stronger do those individual muscles get, but the more you train your body to utilize more muscles through it at the same time. And that is where you get strength that carries over the best into whatever strength endeavor you're talking about, not just a lift, but strength in the real world when you really have to pick something up off someone, or you have to hit someone on a playing field or in an MMA match. Being able to utilize your whole body and more muscles efficiently is going to allow you to produce more force, and that is what strength is. But when it comes to building strength in individual muscles themselves, what you need to understand is that what you want to do is to utilize versions of exercises that allow you to move the heaviest weight possible through the most effective range of motion on an exercise. And what do we mean by the effective range of motion? The range of motion that's going to recruit the most muscle fibers with the least chance of injury to you. In other words, there are exercises where we could add range of motion, but at the expense of joints, connective tissue, rotator cuff health, things like that, or even damaging your back. And that is a point to consider. So a perfect example of what I mean by ones that could damage you, but in some cases, depending on a person's individual anthropomorphology, I hope I pronounced that correctly, different people are going to have different ranges of motion. Like on a deadlift, a deficit deadlift actually has more potential for strength building than a conventional deadlift does. In other words, going on a slight deficit. However, different people's limb lengths, hip mobility, everything else, some people it can cause an excessive amount of lower back rounding, thus a higher risk of injury. So depending upon the individual person, whether you're going to build more strength and, of course, more muscle mass, because the two go hand in hand, between a conventional deadlift, even though a lot of people say, well, conventional deadlift is still a partial. Yeah, for some of the joints and some of the muscles involved, but you've got to remember you're not deadlifting just to build any one given muscle. You're trying to build a dozen different muscles with the deadlift and make them all stronger. So yeah, there are muscles that will not be worked through their full range of motion, but some people cannot do deficit deadlifts. Or the deficit deadlifts eventually start to strain their lower back due to the angles and everything involved, and eventually they want to get strong on a normal deadlift for a competition or something, so they've got to go over to the conventional. Whereas in the sumo, builds less strength. It builds less strength overall because it shortens the total range of motion. Not only does it shorten the range of motion, some people can lift more weight because of it, but some can't. But it shifts muscle balance around and takes some muscles out, but the muscles it adds in, it only moves them through a very short range of motion. So the sumo deadlift, for example, doesn't build as much overall strength as a conventional deadlift does. But again, that comes over to displays of strength. Some people can pull more sumo. Doesn't mean they shouldn't train conventional. In fact, there is at least several world record holders who do sumo in competition and powerlifting who still train the conventional in the off season. Why? Because they know the conventional is a better muscle and strength builder, and they understand that even though they personally can lift 50 pounds more on the sumo. So just something to consider there. Another example of an exercise to where the range of motion itself can be detrimental could be the dip. With a dip, for a lot of people, it's not safe to go more than about parallel. Parallel meaning when your shoulder joint reaches the same depth as your elbow joint. That would be parallel, just like on the squat. Some people are very prone to shoulder injuries if they go deeper than that. But the dip, you are capable of going deeper than that. We are capable of utilizing a longer range of motion than we can safely use. So we're talking about a safe, effective range of motion, and that can vary a little bit from person to person. So the point people will make there, they'll be like, well, so dumbbells are better for building strength and size than the bench because of the longer range of motion. Not always. Because the additional stability involved in the dumbbell press is actually really small muscles involved that fatigue easier, and so no matter what you do with it, even when you cut the range of motion, most people cannot dumbbell press as much as they can bench press. So you're losing a significant amount of strength for sometimes a very small additional range of motion. So what I would tell people on that, if your goal is really to get maximal muscle fiber stimulation in your primary movers, there's another exercise that allows the same range of motion of dumbbells, but you can utilize more weight, and it also involves other muscles, and that would be the weighted dip. So for any purpose in which a person would do a flat or a decline dumbbell press, I would say the weighted dip actually is superior because it allows for the same range of motion, right? You can get that stretch reflex at the bottom, but it allows for a heavier weight. It allows for a heavier weight to be used, and it brings additional big muscles in. It involves the lats and other things because of the angle involved. It actually brings some larger muscles into the movement pattern that don't get utilized with the dumbbell. So overall, the dip is then a superior exercise. And the other thing that you've got to remember, why does the range of motion matter? Because for maximum strength, what is it that you need? Strength is really only a product of hypertrophy and neuromuscular efficiency, right? And the neuromuscular efficiency comes from the heavy weight being utilized, but that heavy weight isn't always just because of the weight, it's because of the tension on the muscles at a given joint angle, right? So when you start cutting out the hardest part of the range of motion to add more weight, you actually aren't taxing those muscles any harder than they would be with the lighter weight. In other words, whether it's a bench press or a deadlift, let's say you go and start doing an above the knee rack pull. Those same muscles are used in the deadlift through that range of motion. Those muscles still get fatigued at the same amount of work, whether you're doing a partial or a full range of motion. But you're trimming muscles out. You have less muscles being used. So in some cases, doing an 800-pound rack pull might not even be putting the same tension on a lot of the muscles that they get with 500 pounds on a deadlift. And because you're changing the levers, you're going to the easier part of the range of motion where you have better levers due to the mechanical position of the bones. A muscle doesn't have to recruit as many muscle fibers to move the same way. So in other words, your lats, thoracic erectors, spinal erectors, all of those things might actually produce less force moving 800 pounds at that joint angle than they would be required to move 500 pounds at a different joint angle. And it's the same when we're talking about a bench press, a squat, or anything else. So what ends up happening is that as you start trimming down range of motion, you have to add more weight in order to get the same muscle fiber recruitment in the fibers that move it through that range of motion. But what happens to the terminal ends? Well, because you've taken some of the terminal ends out of an exercise, there's less muscle fiber recruitment potential. In other words, you have upper threshold fibers in every muscle somewhere through there that only activate through certain parts of the range of motion, right? And it's not most of them, it's a small number of them. The overwhelming majority of the muscles, fibers through most muscles, depending on how complex they are, can be activated at any point in the range of motion. But there are some of them that only can be recruited at certain points, whether it's the middle or the terminal end. So when you start taking the terminal ends of an exercise out, like the bottom 2 inches of a bench press, the bottom 6 inches of a squat, right? Things like that. When you start doing that, there will be muscle fibers in the primary movers that cannot get activated. If they can't get activated, they don't get stronger, and they won't help you get stronger through those terminal ends of the range of motion, because those muscle fibers only contribute to that certain part of the movement of the joint. And if they're not getting hypertrophied and they're not getting trained, guess what? They don't contribute to the strength through that point. So when you start skipping the hardest part of an exercise, some of the specific muscle fibers involved with that joint angle don't grow. So you don't get as much size potential, and you lose a lot of strength potential. They don't always carry over. So if you start trimming range of motion down, you don't get the full potential strength and size development in the muscles you're trying to work. And so if you can find ways to do the full effective range of motion on an exercise, you have the most potential to create strength and the most potential to create muscle size, which is what you want. That's your ideal situation if you're trying to get stronger. So again, when we talk about getting as strong as possible, you need to be using the longest effective range of motion with the heaviest weights that you can utilize through that full range of motion. And that actually is the key to building strength. And people need to understand the difference between building strength versus demonstrating it. Because even a power lifter in their off season might do this stuff to build overall size and strength, and then they switch techniques going into a meet that allows them to lift more weight while producing less force. In other words, finding ways to trim the range of motion down, such as a bigger arch on the bench press, bringing your hands further out, right? Your muscles don't have to contract as hard to move the same amount of weight. So therefore, you at the same strength level can lift a heavier weight, because now you're trying to display strength in a competitive environment versus just building as much strength and muscle mass as you can in the gym. And there's, again, a difference between the two. There's a difference between seeking a leverage advantage to allow you to lift more weight easier versus just getting stronger. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.